Welcome to this last session of our Bible study. We're going to look at law as it's seen in the New Testament, particularly in the teachings of Jesus and also in the writings of St. Paul. For the religious leaders of Jesus' time, the law was all important. But the law of Moses had been overlaid with all sorts of rules about how to keep the law. It's as if the law was this, and then there are all these subsections about how to keep it. And this became one of the main points of contention between Jesus and the scribes and the Pharisees. Jesus didn't reject the law, but he did reject what they did with it. And in fact, on times says all they do is tie people up in knots and don't liberate them and so on. And so it's a battle really in Jesus' ministry between the letter of the law and what Jesus saw as the spirit of the law. If we look back previously to the prophets of the Old Testament, and in particular Jeremiah, they too have got a new twist on the law, and I think this is what Jesus takes up. They tend to see the law as an internal reality, written on the fleshy hearts of God's people, but not carved, as it were, in stone, as was the Ten Commandments in the Exodus story. And this, I would suggest, is Jesus' starting point. So let's take a look at what Jesus' attitude to the law is. I think that can be broken down into three parts. The first is that Jesus comes not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And one can see that in his own life, he is trying to fulfill the spirit of the law. Although his enemies would see that he was breaking the law, he didn't see it that way. The next way in which Jesus talks about fulfilling the law is particularly seen in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's calling on his disciples not just to worry about external behaviour, but to look behind the behaviour and to see what the drive is, what the motivation is. And so he goes deeper. Two examples of this would be when he talks about not committing murder. He seems to equate anger and murderous intent with hate. And then when it comes to adultery, he says that behind the act of adultery lies the problem of lust. And so Jesus is taking it to a different depth, but he's also trying to simplify it. And he does this by saying that basically the law and the prophets can be summed up in two brief commandments: to love God with everything we've got and to love our neighbour as we love ourselves. And so what he seems to be saying is that to act lovingly in each situation, to try and do that, does not break anything to do with the spirit of the law. So if we're seeking in the way we live to demonstrate our love for God and our love for ourselves and our fellow human beings, our neighbour in the widest sense of the word, then we are in fact fulfilling the law. So next, let's turn our attention to St. Paul's take on the law, which we can read about in his various letters. And Paul tells us that he has tried to keep the law to its very letter. He's a member of the strictest sect in Judaism, a Pharisee. But he finds in the end that his best endeavours lead him to in fact break the law. The irony is that in his zeal he breaks the law. He becomes a murderer to all intents and purposes. He casts his vote against St. Stephen when St. Stephen is condemned to death, and he then persecutes the church. And so he is, to all intents and purposes, breaking the spirit of the law. He also comes to another important conclusion. He concludes that sin is kind of dormant without the law, because nobody's there, as it were, to tell you what's right and wrong. But when the law comes in, sin becomes active, and in that sense the law kills him, because he can't keep it and he is condemned by it. And so in the letter to the Romans, which is the most profound document, in his desperation he cries out, "Wicked man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" And so he turns to Christ as his saviour to help him out of this appalling spiritual crisis and dilemma. And that brings us back to something we looked at previously, St. Paul's concept of justification by faith. He takes us back to the story of Abraham, who believes God's promises, and God declares Abraham justified. And he says that if we look to the promises of God through Christ, then we, like Abraham, are justified without the law. And the covenant made with Abraham was before the law appeared on the scene. And also the prophets that we mentioned earlier look to an age when God will make a new covenant with not just his people Israel, but with everybody. And Paul sees this new covenant as coming in the person, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So, how are we to conclude? How are we to see the law in our own lives in a New Testament sense? Well, it seems that faith in the love of Christ leads us to an attempt to be motivated by love in all our actions. And that, in fact, fulfills God's law. And again, as the Apostle puts it, there is no law against that.